My name is Edward Marshall. I'm 65 years old, and I never imagined that one day I would stand in the hallway of the very building I built with my own two hands and listen to my only son tell me coldly, confidently, almost proudly, that I needed to move out because he needed the space, not knowing that the keys he carried, the rent he collected, and the apartment he lived in were all under my name, in my files, on my deeds, and that the entire building he thought he controlled actually belonged to me. It all began the day he married a woman named Chelsea, a sharp-tongued, shiny-eyed 29-year-old who walked like she owned everything she touched. And within months of marriage she had convinced my son, Daniel, that I was a burden, that my presence made them uncomfortable, that old people energy was dragging down their lifestyle, and that if they wanted to grow, they needed me gone. And Daniel, who once begged me for advice, who once held my hand during thunderstorms, who once cried on my chest when his mother passed, suddenly started treating me like an inconvenience. And on the morning it all broke open, he knocked on my bedroom door, yes, my room in my building, and said, "Dad, we've talked about it. We need you to move out by next month." And I stood there stunned, my hand still holding the coffee mug I had made for him earlier, trying to understand how quickly a son could forget what a father had given, because he didn't know, not truly, how much of his life was built on my sacrifices. He didn't know that every late bill he ignored in his 20s was secretly paid by me. Every emergency he faced was quietly resolved by me. Every apartment he rented was subsidized by me. But the thing he least knew, the twist that fate had saved for the perfect moment, was that the entire building he thought he was inheriting someday was never in his hands, not legally, not financially, not even close, because long ago, after my wife died, I placed everything in a trust under my name with strict clauses, strict protections, and not a single loophole for greed or manipulation. Still, after Daniel gave me that ultimatum, I didn't argue. Instead, I simply nodded, walked past him, and let him think he had won, because there is a painful dignity in silence, a power in letting people reveal themselves. And that evening, from the kitchen, I overheard Chelsea giggling loudly, saying, "See? That was easy. Now we can renovate this place. I already called the contractor." And Daniel responded, "Yeah, Dad won't fight it. He never fights anything." And those words cut deeper than the request itself, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had spent years staying silent, letting him grow, letting him breathe, letting him make his own decisions. But I hadn't expected him to mistake my silence for weakness or my love for stupidity. And I realized they didn't just want me out of the apartment, they wanted me out of the building, maybe out of their lives entirely. That night, instead of sleeping, I walked slowly down to the basement office, my office, with the old wooden desk my wife had picked, the lamp she bought, the safe where all my documents were kept, the home of every blueprint, every receipt, every deed. And I opened the thick metal door, pulled out the folder labeled Property, Marshall Residence, Complete Ownership, and set it on the table, staring at my name printed boldly across every page, remembering the decades of sweat that built this place, the years I worked double shifts, the nights I missed dinners just to finish repairs, the walls I painted myself, the floors I installed, the tenants I protected. All that history, and my son believed he could evict me like some old tenant past due on rent. The next morning, Daniel avoided me like a child who knows he's done something wrong but doesn't want to admit it, while Chelsea strutted through the hallway measuring walls for new shelves she planned to install once I was finally out of their hair. And by noon, she had ordered new furniture delivered to my building, charged to my address as if I were already gone. And honestly, I felt more sadness than anger, because entitlement is a sickness blindness cannot see. But life has a way of waiting for the perfectly sharp moment to slice through lies. And that moment came 3 days later when a group of construction workers arrived with clipboards and tools, asking for the owners to approve the renovation. And Chelsea pushed past me and said, "Yes, yes. I'm the owner's wife, you can deal with me." And the foreman looked confused, glanced down at his sheet, then said the words that shifted the air in the hallway, "I need Mr. Edward Marshall's signature." Chelsea froze. pale, blinking, almost offended, and snapped, "No, you mean my husband, Daniel Marshall," but the foreman shook his head, pointed at the contract, and repeated, "Ma'am. The property owner listed here is Edward Marshall. He has to approve everything," and Daniel, who had just stepped out of the bedroom, stared at me with wide, confused eyes. The same eyes he had as a boy when he accidentally broke something and didn't know how to explain it, and he whispered, "Dad, the building is yours?" And I answered calmly, "Son, it always was." And in that moment, Chelsea's mouth dropped open so wide I thought she might faint. But I didn't raise my voice, didn't gloat, didn't scold. I simply walked past them, signed the necessary forms, and told the foreman, "Cancel all renovation plans. Nothing changes unless I say so," and he nodded firmly while Chelsea sputtered like an engine running out of lies. When the workers left, Daniel followed me into the living room, closing the door behind him with shaking hands, and he said softly, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" And I turned to him and said, "Because a man shouldn't love his father for what he owns. He should love him for who he is," and he sank onto the couch, realizing how badly he had failed that test. Chelsea, on the other hand, burst in with fury, demanding, "So what now? He gets to control everything?" And before I could respond, Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw the greed, the manipulation, the entitlement he had been blind to, and he said, "Chelsea, you pushed this. You told me to force my own father out of his home," and she screamed back, "Because I didn't know he owned the place," which told Daniel everything he needed to know about her motives. A long silence followed, a silence heavy, sharp, revealing, and then Daniel turned to me and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I messed up," and I could see in his eyes the boy he used to be, not the man shaped by someone else's selfishness. And I placed my hand on his shoulder and responded, "Son, mistakes don't define you, how you fix them does." And as Chelsea stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to shake the wall, Daniel broke down in tears, saying he didn't want to lose me, that he didn't want to be the kind of man who betrays his own blood, and that he would do anything to make it right. I didn't move out, in fact. Daniel asked if he could move into a different unit while he and Chelsea took a break, and I let him because growth requires space, not punishment. Weeks passed, the tension slowly dissolved, and one evening Daniel knocked on my door, not with demands, not with arrogance, but with humility, and said, "Dad, can we have dinner together? Just us?" And as we sat at the small kitchen table, eating the same meal his mother used to cook, he finally asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Dad, what would you have done if I forced you out?" And I looked at him, smiled gently, and replied, "I would have left, but because you had the right to make me. I would have left because sometimes a father gives even when it hurts, hoping the child will come home someday," and tears filled his eyes again. But this time they weren't from guilt, they were from understanding. Today, Daniel treats me with a level of respect he never had before. And sometimes respect doesn't grow in comfort, it grows in confrontation with truth. And the truth that day hit him like a storm. As for Chelsea, she eventually came back trying to fix things. But Daniel was different now. He had seen her clearly, and the marriage quietly ended. Life has a strange way of revealing people's hearts when inheritance and ownership come into play. But the biggest lesson wasn't about property or power, it was about love, dignity, and the hard truth that sometimes your children need to lose you for a moment to realize your value. And to this day, whenever I walk through the halls of my building, the building I built, the building that holds decades of memories, I smile to myself knowing that I didn't have to raise my voice or fight a battle. I just had to let the truth speak. And the truth was simple. My son asked me to move out of a home he didn't know I owned. And in trying to push me away, he ended up finding his way back to me.